got. I see my friend Dr. Harris here would be delighted to yield to my friend Dr. Harris. Oh. Okay. All right. Well, at this time then I would yield back my time.
The gentleman has yielded the remainder of his hour to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much. If I might inquire the chair how much time I have remaining?
16.
16. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah. And I want to thank the gentleman from Texas who spoke so eloquently about the condition of the country and the condition we're left in. I want to remind the American people that one of the obstacles we still have to overcome is that we have a health care plan that was passed out of the last Congress that isn't in full effect yet, but we're starting to feel the problems with it. What I'm referring to is, of course, what other people, everyone calls the Obamacare legislation. Passed 2.5 years ago now, not fully implemented until after this next election, but influencing Americans in their daily lives. Now, the majority of Americans don't agree with the plan. A majority of Americans don't want the plan, but we still have it. Interestingly, about a third of Americans think we don't have it anymore, that when the House passed their repeal last year in January, one of the very first actions we took in the new House, they thought we were done with it. America could wash its hands of it. But in fact, the repeal bill was sent to the Senate, where as many bills coming out of the House this year, it suffered the same fate. It sits in the Senate without the Senate taking action to do what the American people want, which is to repeal Obamacare. America understands that that bill has many, many problems, some of which we'll talk about in the next few minutes, just to remind Americans this is still there, it's still causing problems. The gentleman from Texas spoke about our problems with our economy. As I go through the district, I talk to businessmen and women every week, and they tell me the same thing. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about government regulation. They're worried about health care insurance for their employees because they're worried about what the effect of Obamacare is. And as this shows, 74% of American businesses surveyed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce say the recent health care law, that's Obamacare, makes it harder for their businesses to hire more employees. The bottom line is they don't know what the rules are. The rules are changing. As we know, 1,700 businesses and unions had to get waivers from that bill in order to keep their health care going this year. 1,700. And of course, those waivers disappear in a year. The businesses don't know what's going to happen once those waivers expire. Real-life example. A furniture business owner in the 5th District of Texas, this is what he said. I could start 2 companies and hire multiple people, but based on this administration and the lack of facts with Obamacare, I will continue to sit and wait. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, America knows that you can't possibly make another empty government promise to ensure 14 million additional Americans while you are going to save money, increase access, and increase quality. Americans have figured this out a long time ago. You can't get all those things, and they know and they suspect what's going to happen is what will happen. The quality will go down, and the amount of money spent on other health care programs by the government will go down. What's the other major health care program paid for by the government? Medicare. Obamacare bill takes $500 billion out of Medicare over the next 10 years. $500 billion. Most worrisome is how it takes those $500 billion out of Medicare. It sets up what's called the Independent Payment Advisory Board. Now, every American ought to be familiar with those terms because this is what's going to control your health care when you get old or your parent gets old or a loved one you know enters Medicare. These 15 bureaucrats, chosen by the President, not accountable to anyone, with no appeal of their decision, will decide what gets covered and what doesn't get covered in Medicare when the government runs short of money. Now, Mr. Speaker, you read the same headlines I do. The government's $15.2 trillion short of money with no end in sight. The President's last budget, submitted to Congress a year ago, we're waiting to see the budget he's supposed to have submitted next week, which we understand will be a week or two late. That budget never balanced. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't have that luxury in my household. I actually have to make a budget balance. And, Mr. Speaker, I would never make a financial move that I knew was passing along a debt to my children and my family. I wouldn't go out, buy a big house, buy a big car, take an expensive vacation, put it on a credit card that I knew my children are going to have to pay. But, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what the President's budget and Obamacare does. It takes the big government credit card, which has already passed its credit limit, $15.2 trillion, runs it through the swiper one more time and says we're going to insure 14 million more people, but don't worry, the cost will go down, the access will go up, and the quality will go up. Americans just don't believe it, and they have a right not to believe it. This 15-member board, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, IPAB is what we call it around here. What you ought to call it is about your rationing panel. Mr. Speaker, what they are 15 bureaucrats specifically excluding a practicing physician from making those, specifically excluding someone who practices medicine from participating in the decisions of what Medicare is going to cover and not cover if and when the government runs out of money. But we know the government's going to run out of money. We know Medicare is going to exceed its budget. It does every year. But if that were all that was bad in the bill, we might be able to just repeal that and move on, but it's not. We saw earlier there were provisions on small businesses called the 1099 provision, making small businesses do tens of billions of dollars worth of paperwork so that the government collect a few billion dollars more in taxes, meanwhile strangling small businesses. This Congress was smart enough to repeal that aspect. Just last week, we repealed another aspect of the bill. It was called, strangely enough, the Class Act. Now, what this act did is this was long-term insurance, long-term care insurance under the Medicare provisions that starts collecting the premiums now but doesn't provide services until the future, meanwhile spending those premiums on other expenses in the government. Sound familiar? Sound like what's happening to your Social Security dollars and your Medicare employment taxes now, your payroll taxes? It's exactly what this was. Set up what even Democrats called in the Senate a Ponzi scheme that would make Bernie Madoff proud. So we repealed it. But last week, and perhaps one of the worst parts of the bill, which really had nothing to do with money, was when the Secretary of Health held that religious institutions had to provide care under their insurance policies that was not consistent with their religious beliefs. That is, sterilization, contraception, and abortion, full coverage, no deductible, zero deductible, putting it in the same category as breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, the other measures that were meant to be covered by that clause in Obamacare, the preventive care clause. Now, Mr. Speaker, that assumes if you want to prevent illness, that pregnancy is a disease, or pregnancy is an illness. What a long way we've come from when society felt that pregnancy was something to be celebrated. It was an extension of life. It was an extension of society. The next generation, the Secretary of, and I put it in quotes, Health in this administration has decided that pregnancy is a disease or illness that needs to be prevented. That's not a good recipe for the future of our society or this country. And worst of all, it's a stark violation of the First Amendment of the United States that the government shall not compel anyone to go against their religious principles. They'll tell you there's an exemption, but there isn't. Yes, if you're a church, you're the church itself, you are, but God forbid that church goes into the community, runs a center for social justice, a center for adoption, a hospital. That religious institution running that other entity would be forced to provide coverage for something that is antithetical to the religious beliefs of that religion. Ladies and gentlemen, that is just wrong. It's bad policy, and it violates the First Amendment of the United States. Mr. Speaker, if I might inquire, how much more time do I have remaining?
The gentleman has approximately 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. So let's walk through some of what is so. Why do we need to repeal this bill? The bottom line is there is so much wrong with this bill. A bill that not only will cut $500 billion from current Medicare recipients, because you'll hear a lot of talk about, oh, that Ryan bill, it destroyed Medicare as we know it. Well, they forget to tell you that it doesn't touch Medicare for people over the age of 55. In fact, we restore that $500 billion for people who are currently covered or for people who are 55 and older, who will be entering Medicare in the next 10 years. The little secret of Obamacare is it takes current Medicare and cuts it by $500 billion. Now, my mother's 88 years old. I don't want a 15-panel board of bureaucrats in Washington making a life and death decision for whether she gets Medicare treatment paid for by 15 bureaucrats sitting in Washington who never met her. I think that decision ought to be made by my mother and her health care providers. No government bureaucrat in the room. No appointed bureaucrat with no appeals process who can say, no, we don't really know your specific situation, but you know what, this is what it sounds like to us, and we think that shouldn't be covered, so you're not getting that care covered. And ladies and gentlemen, you know what the cost of medical care, if the government says it's not covering it, it's not getting done. Is that the way we want health care delivered in the United States? Is that what we want? Do we want a bill that says what kind of care you're going to receive, even if you're not on Medicare, that you have to go into specific health care plans, your employer is shoehorned into them? That promise, don't worry, if you like your plan, you'll keep it, had to have 1,700 waivers in the first year alone. 1,700 waivers. That's not the kind of health care we need. That's not the kind of health care plan we need. Do we want a plan that can be taken to the extreme by the Secretary of Health to say that we're going to violate closely, deeply held religious principles in certain religions in the United States, and we're going to force those people to do things against their religion? Is that what we've come down to? So, ladies and gentlemen, the cure is simple. We need to simply repeal Obamacare. There is too much wrong with it. We tried to fix it piece by piece. We tried to pull out the things that hurts with small business. We tried to deal with why you need 1,700 waivers. We tried to deal with that long-term care coverage. I'm convinced that bill will go to the Senate, it'll die. We'll have instituted as yet another Ponzi scheme in the United States. And those are not words from this side of the aisle. That's the words of a Democrat senator describing that long-term care plan that was part of Obamacare. The one that takes your dollars that you will put in it now, spends it now with a promise, don't worry, when you get old and need it, there'll be some money there. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard that before. That dog don't hunt anymore. We've heard it with Medicare. We've heard it with Social Security. Americans have realized this Congress has spent us into bankruptcy with promises like that in the past. If we've made those promises in the past, we have to keep the promises we've made. But, ladies and gentlemen, we have not implemented the Obamacare bill in its fullest, and now is the time to repeal it before we begin that. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's why over the next few weeks you'll hear, and Mr. Speaker, we'll see things come to the floor that deal with it like we did last week, that repealed that Long-Term Care Act that a Democrat senator called a Ponzi scheme that Bernie Madoff would be proud of. A Ponzi scheme that Bernie Madoff would be proud of. That's why congressional approval rating is at 9%. Because America watches as we come down to Washington and create Ponzi schemes. It's just time to stop. It's time for common sense to prevail. Common sense is we have to stop spending more money than we have. We have to stop burdening the hard-working taxpayers of America. We have to balance our budget. We have to pass a balanced budget amendment so the future Congresses can't create more Ponzi schemes. We have to deal with the debt and the deficit. Are they hard decisions? They certainly are. Are they decisions the American public expects us to come together and make? They certainly do. Let's rise to the occasion. I joined with the President who a week ago said, let's work together to solve these problems. Mr. President, you don't solve these problems by impeding people's First Amendment rights to the freedom of religion. You don't solve these problems by proposing $300 billion new stimulus spending in your State of the Union speech. You don't solve these problems by going out doubling down on Solyndra. You don't solve these problems by denying the Keystone XL pipeline. Mr. President, we're ready. Let's come together and solve America's problems. And, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman yields back the remainder of the time. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Frank, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, preliminarily, I'm here to discuss today's very encouraging jobs report. I am struck the previous speaker said he would never engage in expenditures on a credit card when we were already deeply in debt on behalf of his family. I note that he was not a member of the Congress when this Congress voted to go to war in Iraq, for example, and also in Afghanistan. I voted for the war in Afghanistan. I thought the war in Iraq was a terrible mistake and still do. All of us who voted to go in Afghanistan were voting to go into further debt. War is very expensive. We don't want to send our young people into battle, even some of our middle-aged people, without the best possible equipment. So we went to war. I thought we had to go to war in Afghanistan in self-defense. I thought the war in Iraq was a terrible error. A majority of my colleagues, including virtually every Republican, voted to do that. So this principle that you don't vote to spend money when you don't have it is apparently, for some, a fairly flexible one. And in fact, not only did the majority at that time under President Bush vote to go into two wars, they did it while voting for several large tax cuts. So they were exacerbating that very difficulty. As I said, I voted to go to war in Afghanistan. I was prepared to vote for some revenues to pay for it. Mostly, though, I want to talk today about the very encouraging report we got today about the economy. We are in the early stages of a recovery. It's not going nearly fast enough. What is now clear is that the recession that President Obama inherited from the previous administration in 2009 when he took office was deeper than people realized at the time. It was clearly the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and in many ways was more disabling in the sense of the interconnections, although overall it was not. And President Obama and others underestimated the depths of that recession. Many of us did. So the recovery has been slower than it should have been in the interest of the American people. But the fact is, very clearly, it is underway. I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about what's retarding it. One of the interesting things today was the job number, 257,000 private sector jobs created, a very significant number, enough if it is a pattern to continuously cut into the unemployment figure. But it was accompanied by a 14,000 job reduction in public sector employment. And that, unfortunately, is a pattern. If you go back to the worst of the recession, the end of 2009, remember President Obama comes in early 2009, we did pass an economic recovery package, which is clearly, by virtually every economist's acknowledgement, improved the situation. It didn't cure it. It didn't do as much to reduce the rate as had been hoped because the deficit in the economy was deeper. But since that end of 2009, when things began to turn around, after we had passed an economic recovery program that began to help, after the Federal Reserve, under a Bush appointee, Ben Bernanke, reappointed by President Obama, continued its stimulative efforts, here's what's happened, basically since the last months of 2009, the beginning of 2010. We have had in this economy, in a 2-year period, the creation in the private sector of 3,663,000 jobs, approximately. You can't be exact, but over 3.6 million jobs. Unfortunately, during the same time period, a couple months earlier, public sector employment has declined by more than 550,000 jobs. In other words, if the public sector had simply been allowed to stay even, if there hadn't been firings of firefighters and people who shovel the snow and clean the streets and maintain the parks and teach young people and preserve law and order, if we hadn't fired police officers, public works employees, municipal engineers, teachers, sanitary workers, if we hadn't required them to be fired by a perverse set of federal budget policies that had that negative impact on the municipalities, we would have had 500,000 more jobs. We wouldn't, and I'm not talking now about the public sector increasing. If the public sector had simply been allowed to stay even, if this Congress had not sent money to build Afghanistan, futilely in my judgment, if it hadn't wasted money in a war in Iraq that never should have begun, and it kept that money home, and we could have had more police officers and firefighters and teachers and public works employees working here in our country, then the unemployment rate would be below 8% today. This is exactly the opposite of what my Republican colleagues claim. Oh, the public sector, they say, is strangling the private sector. No, the truth is exactly the opposite. The private sector has increased, not yet at the rate we had hoped, although if the private sector can continue to add 250,000+ jobs a month, then we will. That's 3 million jobs a year. That will substantially reduce unemployment to the point which is where we should be. If we can persuade our Republican colleagues to stop forcing the cities and counties and states to lay off important public employees. I got an anguished letter the other day from the mayor of the city of Fall River, Massachusetts, about a great addiction program, the Stanley Star Treatment Program in his town. You want to know why they were cut off from the $1.4 million they had gotten to deal with addiction? The answer is this Congress zeroed out the whole program. I couldn't be their advocate and say, look, this is a good program, give them money, because I was told by the agency involved, yeah, we know it's a good program. You give us money. We can't give out money when you voted against it. That money's in Kandahar. That money's in Basra. And if it was doing any good over there, I would feel better about it. But we are spending money futilely overseas in wars, one of which shouldn't have started and one of which should start. And by the way, it should end. By the way, I heard my colleague, the previous speaker, talk about spending too much. In fact, one of the major criticisms the Republican Party now has, certainly their presidential candidates and many here in the Congress, is not that the president is spending too much, but that he's spending too little. They've criticized him for withdrawing our troops from Iraq, even though it was on a timetable President Bush had set forward. They want more troops in Iraq. Nothing is more expensive than keeping troops in a combat situation or near combat situation, and that's right, because you don't send people into combat without doing everything you can to protect them. There are people who are criticizing the decision to begin to reduce the troops in Afghanistan. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at the height were costing $150 billion a year, over and above the regular military budget. I cannot think of anything less consistent than to argue that A, we should be reducing the deficit, and B, we should be continuing to spend money not just on military activity, but on nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's go back to the job situation. 3.6 million private sector jobs created in 2 years. By the way, that has been reflected in the economy. On March 9th of 2009, then Speaker Pelosi, Mr. Speaker, convened a meeting in which we talked about some things we thought we should do for the financial sector. It was the beginning of our efforts to do financial reform. I know the Republicans think that financial reform is a terrible idea, that apparently we should have left derivatives unregulated. We shouldn't have an independent consumer bureau. We should continue the practice whereby people could make loans to people who shouldn't get them and then sell those loans to other people so they had no interest in whether or not they were repaid. Because we began our financial reform efforts in March of 2009 and were told it was terrible for the financial industry. The Dow Jones Industrial Average on March 9th was 6,500. By March 9th now, 3 years later, it will very likely be double what it was then. The Dow Jones Industrial Average will have doubled in the aftermath of the passage of the Economic Recovery Act, the Financial Reform Bill, even the Health Care Bill. Maybe I don't claim that we did it, but we certainly didn't retard it. So in that time period, 3.6 million jobs created. In the end of the Bush administration, of course, we went to very substantial job loss. In the first months of the Obama administration and the last months of the Bush administration, job loss was in the hundreds of thousands a month. Now we have begun to turn that around. And again, let's stress, if it hadn't been for federal budget policies forced by this Congress and by others in the Congress who were reluctant to do the right thing, if states and cities had simply been allowed to keep their current level, in other words, if we had had increases in the private sector and held steady over a 3-year period in the public sector, we'd have 500,000 more jobs in America today, and probably more because these things have some multiplier effect. And clearly unemployment would be below 8%. It has dropped from 8.3. By the way, when unemployment went down to 8.9 and then 8.7, the critics of the president said, oh, that's just because the labor force has dropped. Well, the labor force went up in this past month, according to the statistics. More people were encouraged to look for jobs, and with more people looking for jobs, we still had a drop to 8.3% in the unemployment numbers. Now, that is an example of the wrong-headedness of the very conservative approach to the economy. Yes, we have a deficit. It is a very large deficit. Much of it incurred because of the policies of President Bush, supported by Republican majorities in Congress. I'm told, I didn't read it, that the bill we passed yesterday said that the tax cuts under George Bush did not add to the deficit. That is Marxist reasoning, Chico Marxist reasoning. It reminds me of the time in one of the movies where Groucho caught Chico red-handed, and Chico, denying that he had done it, said, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? Bills are passed that cut government revenues by hundreds of billions of dollars, and it didn't add to the deficit. Of course it did. And it added to the deficit at the same time we were incurring further deficits by going to war. I didn't vote for the war in Iraq. I voted for the war in Afghanistan, but I have for some time now thought we should withdraw entirely. It is the Republicans at the presidential level and in the Congress who are insisting that we spend more. We have begun to reduce defense spending. The president made a very radical decision. He said that after the late 40s, when we sent troops to Western Europe and Central Europe to keep Joe Stalin, a vicious, brutal murderer, from invading Central and Western Europe, countries which had been left devastated by World War II, that having done that in 1948 and 49, it was time to withdraw them. Well, according to my Republican friends, that's a terrible mistake. They want to keep those troops in Western Europe. That'd be good for the economies of Europe, and they need them these days. But it's terrible for the United States. The heads of the military have said, you know what, we can take these troops out of Europe and retire them. That doesn't mean you fire them. I was glad to see General Giorno say, we will not dismiss anyone who signed up to serve this country. We are grateful for them. And they should be allowed to serve out fully what they did and get the full veterans' benefits that a grateful nation owes them. But with the turnover in the military in ordinary circumstances, you can reach a reduction fairly soon by simply not hiring new people. Now, I will add that there's another great inconsistency on my Republican colleagues' point. When I debate with them whether or not we should cut spending for firefighters or public works employees, whether we should provide money to build highways, whether we should do things where the federal government provides funds that I believe are job-creating, they tell me, you could look it up in all of the debates that we've had here, that government spending doesn't create jobs. They deny that the government's spending money can create jobs. with one wonderful exception. Apparently, that doesn't apply to military spending, because when it comes to reducing military spending, they have all become the most devoted followers of John Maynard Keynes. They sound like the New Dealers at their most urgent and ardent. The military to them is the world's great public works project. Obviously, it has other functions. But when we talk about reducing the military, all of a sudden, government spending is a great fountain of job creation. Well, the fact is that when you reduce military spending, you can cut back on jobs in the near term, as you can in other areas. I do believe that cutting military spending can result in less job reduction than, for instance, cutting the right kind of medical spending. Yes, we should have comparisons of this, but I'm talking now just about the sheer hypocrisy of arguing that government spending cannot create jobs and then turning around and invoking government spending as a part of the military. In fact, as these numbers show, are having forced states and cities to cut back. And by the way, the reason states and cities have cut back is not simply that we haven't given them federal funds, which I believe in a proper approach to this system we should. That was the radical program, revenue sharing it was called, and community development block grants, which was first put forward by that, I never thought terribly radical Richard Nixon in the 70s. But the fact is that the national economic crisis has hit with particular impact on cities and states, especially since it manifests itself in low housing prices. Of all the levels of government in this country, local, state, and federal, it's the local governments that rely most heavily on the property tax. So when property is devalued, as it has been by factors far beyond the control of any city, the city's revenues suffer. And so it's a combination of their natural revenue base suffering because of national policies, because of the denial of funding on programs that have existed since Richard Nixon, that they have had to lay off over 500,000 people. And because they've laid off 500,000 people, instead of there being a net 3.6 million increase in jobs in the last couple of years, it's 3.1 million. 550,000 jobs would be better than 0.3% on the unemployment figures. It would reduce unemployment. And here is, of course, the great mistake the conservative ideology makes, and you're seeing it in Europe as well. By the way, I don't think it's an accident that in America, President Obama has resisted this notion that we should make even further and further cuts domestically. I do acknowledge that my colleagues are big spenders when it comes to Iraq, Afghanistan, bases in Europe, and other military expenditures, much less useful, I think, for our economy. But in Europe, they have been following, until recently, the notion of austerity. As today's numbers make clear, well, we have a way to go in our economy, and we need to work to cooperate to keep this economic recovery going and get it more vigorous. Of all the major developed economies in the world, the American economy is doing the best. Obviously, the developing ones, India, China, starting from a lower base, they're doing better. But if you look at the major industrialized nation, we are doing better because we have resisted excessive austerity. Now, sometimes intelligence requires an ability to make distinctions that is beyond some people. Yes, we have a deficit. We have to reduce the deficit. But at the same time, we have a serious unemployment problem, which is getting less serious. It's still serious. But 8.3% is better than 8.9% or 9.1%. And 7.9% would have been even better if they hadn't forced cities and states to lay off cops and public works employees and teachers and firefighters. But what we need to be able to do is to work on both of these. In the near term, some stimulative activity to deal with the unemployment situation is a good thing. This is not a time to choke off this recovery. But precisely because we are in the early stages of recovery, we can, if we do the right thing in the near term, begin with the end of this current year, start cutting back on the deficit. Now, it's interesting, by the way, that one of the ways you do that will be to continue to reduce military spending, along with other things. But what do my Republican colleagues say? Oh, no, you can't reduce another penny of military spending. One of the things I've been told, by the way, is that we've hollowed out the military in past years. I wrote to Secretary of Defense Panetta, who, to my surprise, claimed that after the end of the Cold War, we had hollowed out the military. I was surprised because Leon Panetta was the budget director during that period after the Cold War under President Clinton. So apparently this was a confession that he himself had hollowed out the military. But I don't think we did. And I've written him and I ask others, would anyone please come forward and say on this floor of the House, Mr. Speaker, or elsewhere, given the argument that we held out the military, can anyone show me one example of where in the period after the demise of the Soviet Union, one of the great things that happened for human history, we needed to apply military force and didn't have it? President Clinton didn't lack for the appropriate force in southern Yugoslavia to accomplish his goals. George Bush, in the immediate end of the Cold War, was able to do Iraq, the first President Bush. The second President Bush had too much military, from my standpoint, in terms of what he used, going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time. No, this argument that we'd hollow out the military is nonsense. With the reductions that are planned, we will still be by far the strongest military in the world and well able to defend ourselves. And yes, if we're going to reduce the deficit, we have to put cuts in a lot of places. We can cut the Social Security goes to wealthy people. I receive Social Security. I'm prepared to vote to have it all taxed away. That's an effective way to means test it, not by a complicated process at the outset. But those of us who make a certain income and we're getting Social Security, give us a 95% tax. That'll work very efficiently. I'm prepared to put some constraints in spending domestically on programs I like, but exempting the military, as my Republican colleagues want, trying to scare the American people by saying that if we are only 5 times as strong as our nearest adversary, we'll somehow be in danger, that isn't remotely the case. Continuing to maintain a full complement of weaponry to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War when it's long since imploded, none of those make sense. But here's the point. If we commit ourselves to longer-term deficit reduction, then we can, without in any way causing any loss of confidence, do the short-term spending that will help us. And by the way, the other area we should be working to reduce the deficit is in taxation. One of the controversies we have now is our proposal that many of us support to put a surtax on income for people who earn more than $1 million a year. It's called the millionaire's tax, but that's a misleading name. You can have $10 million in your estate and in your accounts and still not be earning $1 million a year. We're not just talking about people who have $1 million or 2 or 3 or 4. We're talking about people who earn $1 million a year in taxable income every year. And what we've said is that every time you earn more than $1 million a year, for every 1,000 in taxable income, after all your deductions that you earn, we're going to tax you $56. $56 per 1,000 out of people who are already earning $1 million. It's nonsense to suggest that would in any way be disturbing to them or to their spending patterns, but it would help us reduce the deficit. So yeah, I want to shore up Medicare. I was struck that the previous speaker had 2 complaints about the president. One, that he's spending too much money, and 2, that he's not spending enough. He complained about cuts in Medicare. In fact, those were not cuts that went to any beneficiary or even to the actual providers in a real sense. It went to some insurance companies that were getting more than they needed. But if we will include the military and put constraints elsewhere, and ask the wealthiest people in this country to pay some taxes. By the way, this argument that tax increases kill the economy, the last time I heard it was when President Clinton asked Congress to raise taxes on incomes above $150,000, a far lower figure than we're talking about today, even correcting for inflation. He said, raise the tax on people making $150,000, put the top rate from, 36 to 39.6%, a fairly small increase, I thought, at the time. And we did it over the objection of the right-wing economists, and they told us it would be the end of the economy. In fact, subsequent to that, in the many years after that, we had one of the best economic performances in American history. Not necessarily because we raised taxes, but even though we did. The fact is that people who thought these arguments greatly exaggerate the sensitivity of this vast, complex, strong American economy to fairly small changes in tax rates. But the point is that we have been told before that increasing by a fairly small amount taxes on the very wealthy, and as I said, we were talking then 150. We're talking about a much higher figure today. That's a way to help reduce the deficit. Constraining the military to help reduce the deficit. And that brings me back to the point of these job numbers. Totally contrary to what the Republican presidential candidates are saying when they take time out from saying terrible things about each other, but I will give them credit. As I listen to the Republican candidates make the most devastating, negative personal attacks on each other, I do have to concede that they are almost always right in what they say about each other. But when they lay off each other, They make extraordinarily negative, excessively denigrating comments about our country, talking about how this country is no longer respected in the world, directly contrary to all the evidence. Denigrating our economy when we are today the best performing major developed economy in the world. Still not good enough. But it would be better still if the Republicans would cooperate with us instead of trying to make things worse. 250,000 new private sector jobs, including increases in manufacturing. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, a significant part of that was because the government intervened over the objection of the Republicans now running for president and many in Congress to help the automobile industry. Let me read from yesterday's New York Times. Headline, in a surprise, car sales start New Year strongly. And it says that American and other automobile dealers are doing very well. And then Chrysler ends quarter with $225 million profit. The comeback from bankruptcy at Chrysler hit a milestone when the smallest reported its first full year of positive earnings since 2005. And as it makes very clear, it says this is a company that just 3 years ago needed a government bailout and a trip through bankruptcy to survive. The fact is that the intervention initiated by President Obama and supported by this Congress, particularly our Democratic members, with some Republicans, but with most of them opposing it, rescued General Motors and Chrysler. General Motors is today the #1 automobile company in the world. Wouldn't have been if we'd listened to the Republicans. Manufacturing employment has begun to increase, partly because we've gotten these jobs back at Chrysler and General Motors. And by the way, among those that were strongly supportive of the intervention was Ford. Now, Ford had been prudent and had borrowed some money or had mortgaged itself and had some cash. They didn't need a direct participation in the funds that came from the TARP, that hated TARP. But they strongly supported it because they knew that if General Motors and Chrysler weren't able to continue to function, the supply chain in America would dry up. That would have cost more jobs, and it would have put Ford at a disadvantage. So we have a thriving American automobile industry today. It's on the upswing that we wouldn't have had if we listened to the Republican argument that government always is bad. Although, I make an exception. Government is always bad unless it's the military. They impute to the military powers beyond what it has, it seems to me. You know, I just would make the point, our military is a superb instrument full of extraordinary people, and they are very good at doing what a military should do, stopping bad things from happening. It is not fair to them and unrealistic to expect them to be able to make good things happen. Yes, they can stop murderers, but the best armed, most thoughtful young Americans ever assembled aren't going to be able to get the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds to like each other, or to bring to Afghanistan what it's never been able to get, sadly. I wish we could. But we don't do it with American firepower. But with the exception of the military, we hear only negatives about government. In fact, we have a private sector that has begun to connect. We are now at a pace to reduce unemployment to a reasonable level. If it hadn't been for the job reductions in the public sector forced by many here, we'd be even better off. And by the way, we are talking about people who provide services essential to the quality of life, people who pave the streets and shovel the snow and deal with the sewage and clean up the parks and police and fire. These are essential people. We have 500,000 less of these people. We're not talking about federal bureaucrats here. These job losses are mostly at the state and local level. We have 500,000 less of them. We have, fortunately, 3.6 million more private employees in this period of recovery from the recession. If we had been able just to maintain the public sector, we'd be lower in unemployment. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that people will look at this, that they will stop this mindless, partisanly motivated trashing of America when we are doing better than any other developed economy of any size, even though we are held back to some extent by them, that they will instead join with us in saying, look, let's understand that we need spending constraints across the board, including the military, that the wealthiest people in this country, the people running hedge funds, can afford to pay a regular tax and not get that carried interest boondoggle that is in no way an incentive to economic activity, but simply makes them richer. I understand why they'd rather be richer, although many of them are, I think, public spirit enough to say, you know, let's change this. Let's put some spending constraints on across the board. Let's raise revenues in a way that will not have a negative effect on the economy or on the quality of lives of those people paying it. And let's lock in that so that in the near term, we can stop forcing states and cities to lay people off. We can continue the kind of policies that will help put some people back to work in the construction industry, such as in highways. We can also, I hope, get the people at the Federal Housing Finance Administration to stop resisting the administration's effort to help with housing. If there is cooperation, if we learn the lessons of the past, we can make this economy work. And I would include one final point, and I'll be talking about this some more. One of the great successes we have seen in the past few years has been the policies under a Bush appointee, Benjamin Bernanke, George Bush's chief economic advisor, who George Bush gave the most important economic post in America, chairman of the Federal Reserve. Chairman Bernanke has pushed hard to have the Federal Reserve be a constructive force in our economy. People on the right in particular were saying, oh, it's going to cause terrible inflation. Rarely in American history has a flat prediction been more wrong. The quantitative easing, the intervention of the Fed has produced no inflation. It has made money for the federal government. It hasn't cost us anything. It has been very helpful. In fact, the Fed has been setting a good example for Europe. And one of the best things that's happened with regard to Europe lately, as perceived by the markets as well as others, is that people noted that the European Central Bank was beginning to take some of the lessons from the U.S. Federal Reserve and work more like them. So if we stop trying to harass the Federal Reserve from the reasonable pro-expansionary policies it's been following, if we stop forcing state and local governments to fire people who perform useful services and are unfortunately added to the unemployment figures, if we will produce federal funding not to try to mediate a dispute in Iraq, but to build highways here and to clean up our water systems, and if we will ask the wealthiest people in America to give a little bit more, which they won't miss, but which will help us, then the good day we had today, and it was a very good day in the economic news. I noticed even Fox News almost grudgingly had to say, wow, what a good economic report. I'll give Chris Wallace credit because he cut right through and said that when there was someone who wanted a carp. 250,000 private sector jobs today, we can keep that up. And maybe the 257,000 private sector jobs will become 300,000, and maybe we'll add 5 or 10,000 of those public sector jobs that were lost where we need cops and firefighters and people to keep our cities clean. And we are, if this Congress, through an ideological rigidity that has been proven wrong by the facts, does not interfere, if we are supportive of the very sensible program that the President has laid out, independently supported by that Bush appointee, Mr. Bernanke at the Federal Reserve, America can continue to have the best developed economy in the world, and we can get the kind of recovery that the American people deserve. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
I'm going to move. We go to recess for a week.
South Florida.
Anywhere, just so they can make some appointments.
Great sense of humor.
Actually, I am running for it. We're going to Orlando. My partner's a big surfer. He's the big center for surfing.
Oh, in Orlando. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until noon on Monday next for morning hour debate.
The House adjourning for the week, returning Monday at 10 Eastern for general speeches and noon for legislative work. Earlier today, lawmakers passed a measure that changes the federal budgeting process. It requires the Congress